All right, welcome everyone to week four of WOOFCODE. So last week we finished off our intro JavaScript stuff, and you should now be in a position where, after all that overload of syntax for so long, we finally know pretty much everything that we really need to know with JavaScript to program pretty much anything. There are more efficient ways of doing things with JavaScript. There are different less efficient ways of doing things with JavaScript. You definitely shouldn't feel like you're a total expert with JavaScript, but the tools that we have, the variables, the data structures, the different types that we know about, we can pretty much find a hack to execute pretty much anything. And in theory, we could write any kind of program that takes some inputs and gives back some outputs. So this week, we might have been wondering, okay, those first 2 weeks that we did this course, we were covering HTML and CSS, and suddenly we're covering JavaScript, which is something different. This week is going to be all about stringing together the HTML and CSS files that we talked about early on, and getting to play with that HTML and CSS using JavaScript. So we'll be manipulating things on the screen with our JavaScript code. And to do that, we'll be covering element selectors and events, which let us react to things. So first thing that I want to talk about today is something called the document object model. So I'll explain what that is, and we'll talk about how we can use it to use JavaScript to make edits to our code. Basically, the DOM is all about finding, accessing, and updating things on the screen using our JavaScript code. So up to now in this course, whenever we've seen something like HTML, we've sort of seen it as this like flat thing where there's this text that all sort of goes at the same level. We have these tags. Some of these tags are sort of meshed inside of other tags. And that's one way of viewing HTML. But with JavaScript, we can also view HTML as a tree. So a tree is one of these sort of computer sciencey / logical logical mathematics thing that sounds kind of complicated. But you always talk about these nodes, these children, and these parents. And you can sort of think about it as like a family tree. Except there's only one person there's only one parent, not two parents, so it's maybe not so much like a family tree. But essentially, okay, every node in the tree can have different numbers of children. And in the context of HTML, a child is just another element which is nested inside of the element. So we have some numbers of children for every node, and then every node has a parent element, except for this HTML element, which is sort of like the grandfather of our HTML file that contains everything. So we could see this exact same block of code right here as this sort of tree structure. So there's the HTML element that wraps everything. Inside the HTML element, we have this head tag, this head element, and we have this body element. Inside the head, this is all sort of this meta information about the page, like the title and some styles that we could put in there. And then the body is sort of everything that shows up on the screen at the end of the day. So in this case, we've got this H1, we've got this P, and we've got this image. So we could say, okay, each one of these elements exists as a node in this tree. And then using JavaScript, we can then access one of these elements. We can think about it as a node on this tree. We can find what the parent is. We can find what the siblings are. We can add things to the HTML tree. And ultimately, we can manipulate this HTML, which so far we've seen as just a wall of text. And we can find a way to move things around, to change things, to access things in a better way by using this sort of tree structure. Okay, so this word DOM, document object model, the reason it's called this is that your browser when it finds an HTML page, by default, it will load up the contents of the website into a nice tree like this. So we have this this thing that we can move around on and find nodes from. And it'll store it in your JavaScript in a variable called document. So there's essentially this global variable called document, which is just like a JavaScript representation of this HTML document. And it's an object. So the objects that we learned about last lecture, the document is an object. So it has properties and it has methods that we can use. And the DOM is just saying, okay, it's the model of looking at the world, looking at HTML, using a document, which is an object, basically. So just shorthand is DOM. All it really is, okay, we have a tree with lots of nodes. And this sort of summarizes what we have in our HTML. So in terms of what we can actually do with this DOM, we can access this HTML from within our JavaScript. And using the HTML, we can change some content. So we could edit some attributes of a particular HTML element. We can add some new attributes in. We could even wipe out everything on the screen and just put something totally different. And this gives us a lot of power with what we can do with JavaScript. Most modern front-end frameworks that people use these days, so this is stuff like Angular or Vue or React, builds the entire website just by using JavaScript. The sort of different things that you use for that, you wouldn't be using the same element selectors and the same methods that we have from the document model to do that in React or Vue or Angular. But all of those platforms are based on this idea that it is possible through this document object to edit things on the website and add new things to the web page. So the most simple way to grab an element on the screen is using this getElementById method that comes on this document object. So again, this word document, we can put this anywhere in our JavaScript, and our browser, whenever it finds an HTML page, it's going to grab the HTML, it's going to summarize it into this document, and this document object has a bunch of properties and methods already baked into the document. So one of those methods is getElementById. And getElementById, we can pass in an ID of an element on the page, and it will get an object representation of that node in the tree. So, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so we have the document. We can say, okay, we pass in a particular ID. If that ID matches one of these elements that we have in this tree, then JavaScript will return something that we can work with in our JavaScript file that represents that element, which is super nice. So an example of this in action, let's say we have this image tag in our HTML file. We have an ID of cat-pic. We can use document.getElementById, passing in the string of cat-pic, and then this gives us a node that represents this image tag. So I'll come back to this as an example in a couple of slides' time. We'll do a little demo. There's going to be lots of little demos today to show how this works. So that's one way. We have this getElementById method. It turns out there are a few different methods that we can use. I'm just going to teach 3 methods in this class. There are methods called getElementsByTagName and getElementsByClassName. And I think there's a couple of other getElementsByName. But I think that you can do pretty much everything with these 3 that I'm going to teach. And I'd rather not teach too much stuff that confuses everyone. So I would just get really good at using these 3. So we've got getElementById. You pass in the string of an ID of something on the page. It gives you back that one thing. We also have these methods called querySelector and querySelectorAll, which also come from this document object. So the document object, we get it for free. It's an object like anything else. And we have a few methods, which are like functions tied to an object. So it's like, okay, object is this like big super variable with lots of boxes inside of it. A method is just a box that contains a function. So this sort of double parentheses syntax here, this is what we usually do to invoke a function. And that's exactly what we're doing. There's something called query selector that's been stored in this document object that our browser gets for free. And we're just calling this function that's stored in that box. And a function, like anything else, it's a black box that takes some inputs and gets some outputs. So query selector and query selector all. The deal is that we need to pass in a CSS selector. So a CSS selector, we have a few examples here of how this works. For example, if we have a hash in front of something, just like when we're using CSS selectors in our CSS, hash something is an ID. So here we're using query selector, we're passing in hash catpick. Again, it's going to grab the one element on the screen that matches this ID. If you accidentally have more than one element with an ID, which you really shouldn't, like this is kind of the one rule with IDs. An ID is just one thing on the screen. But if you had two elements with an ID, it would only get the first one. That's always the rule with query selector. With just query selector, not query selector all, we always get the first matching element on the page. So the second example here, let's say we had a heading 1 tag. If we use query selector, this time nothing in front of it. So this is always just give me the tag. That's the query selector when there's nothing in front of it. So all of the tags with the name h1. In this case, it'll just get the first element that matches that rule. So this will return a node representation of the heading element, essentially, the first one, only the first one. And then query selector all will give you back essentially an array of all of the matching elements. So these two examples down here, we're passing in just an h1 for this one. So it's all of the heading tags on the page. Nothing in front of it, so that's a tag that we're matching on, and it's just going to give us back basically an array of h1s. And then this one here, we're putting a dot before it. And remember, with CSS selectors, dot always means a class. So we're getting all of the elements on the page that have a class of cat-pick. And this will come basically in an array, as I said. I say basically because it's not technically exactly an array, but it's pretty much an array. So I want to do a little example of how we do this, because it's all quite, what's the word for this? It's not grounded enough for us to fully grasp this, I think. So it'll help just do a little bit of an example. So here I have some HTML that I wrote previously. Really simple page. We've got a heading, we've got some paragraph tags, we've got an image, and then we're including our index.js file in the usual way. And then right now in index.js, I just have a totally blank JavaScript file. So what I want to do here, I'm going to open up the console, and I just want us to play around with just console logging out some of these objects. So I can't even just do this directly in my console. I can write console.log document. So there's no quote marks. It's a variable that we have from JavaScript. And we can see this thing, when we hover over it, it contains the entire page, basically. Like, this is the exact same HTML. This is actually kind of misleading, because I did say that the document object is an object. And Chrome here has sort of translated this into something that's easy to work with. I can hover over different sections and it highlights different things. It turns out there's another command that's really similar to console.log, except it's called console.dir. And I think I'm not really sure what dir stands for, but it's just like a verbose version of whether we wanted to log out, like a more extended version of this pretty printed thing that Chrome gave us. So again, I'm going to go console.log, passing in document. Yeah, and then this time we can see the actual object that we get back. So just like any other object, we have all these different properties. So what's a good one to blah, 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 blah. Okay, input encoding. This is, I'm not really sure what this is about. This is kind of like how the website should view the characters. And I think UTF-8 is like just the standard set of characters that come with pretty much every system. So there's a property somewhere in this document object of UTF-8 for the input encoding. The input encoding is the property, UTF-8 is the property value, just like a regular object. Okay, so this is like the entire page with absolutely everything in it, even the HTML. And I think actually we can probably even see the elements here and sort of traverse this tree. Yeah, so there's something called child nodes here, which shows all of the children that belong to this global document object. And one of these is this HTML. And this one also has some child nodes, I guess. We can see, okay, this is the head, this is the meta information, this is some text, not totally sure what that is. And here's the body. You can sort of see this highlighting, and we could go down this tree to keep looking at everything's children, and we say, okay, the body now has a heading, and then it has some paragraphs, and then it has a picture, basically. So one thing that we could do is just navigate from parent to child from the document right the way down to any element that we want to grab. But the better thing to do is to use these element selectors. So I'm gonna do this in my JavaScript just because it's a little bit cleaner to do it like this. So let's say that we want to grab this heading way at the top of the page. I put in an ID of my-heading, so we should be able to use the getElementById method on the document object to grab that and have it inside of our JavaScript. So I'm going to make a new constant. We'll just call it heading to be super simple. And we can use the document object, and we want the getElementById method. And then I'm going to put in my-heading as the argument to that function. Okay, so this should be a node representation of this heading right here. And I'm just going to make a console log of what we get back from that. Okay, and we can see, okay, this is the exact same element that we wanted. Again, Chrome is sort of messing with this and making it simpler. So I can change this to console.dir to confirm that this is actually an object. And we see again, okay, we've got lots of properties. This is basically every attribute that you could possibly set on this HTML element, and the vast majority are null. The only one really that should have something is the ID of my heading. And we also have this INNERHTML, which I'll discuss in a few slides' time. So that's getting it by element ID. We can also use the query selector and the query selector all. So I want to start off with, let's say, oh, hang on. I'm going to grab this image here. So I can go const image equals document dot query selector. And again, we're passing in the CSS selector. So if we want a tag, then we just put in something without anything before it. An ID is always hashtag something. A class is always dot something. That's always the rule with CSS selectors. That's basically all we need to know with CSS selectors to have a really good grip on being able to do things. So I want to grab all of these paragraph tags. Oh no, actually no, I just want to grab the image tag first. So the image tag, okay, we can just use the tag name of img. And I'll just make a console log here. Console.log image. Okay, and that should pop up. Okay, and that's the one that we wanted. Again, we can use console.dir. And then we have the actual object, the document object model representation of this particular picture. So that seems to work. So the thing that I was saying about query selector, just a single query selector, let's say we have 2 images on the page now, another one and another one. If we're doing the same line again and refresh the page, we'll see that, actually I'll just do console log just to be simpler. We're only getting the first one here. So since we used query selector, we didn't use query selector all, we're only getting the first one. Contrast that to query selector all, which I'll also demo. This time we have basically an array where the first item is the first one, the second item is the second one. I say basically an array because this is technically a node list, so it doesn't have all of the same baked in properties of an array, but this is as good as it gets to an array, and we can use it like an array, which is quite nice. Okay, so that's just grabbing hold of these elements on the screen, and we get them in a form of an object which has lots of properties that we can use. The next step, once we've grabbed one of these HTML elements on the DOM, is to actually do something with them. So it turns out we basically have an object that we basically have an object. This is okay, an array of objects. No, we have an array of objects, and you know, each of these properties on this object is just a regular object, just like we did last lecture. These properties are all attributes. So it turns out that just in the same way that we could change an existing property on an object that we just created, we can do exactly the same thing with this node object. So we can use the dot notation. The dot notation again is just, okay, go into the box within the box of this object. And if we use syntax like this, where we're putting an equal sign and something on the right-hand side, then that's assignment. So it says, okay, kick out whatever's in this src attribute, and I want the new value to be whatever I put on the right-hand side. So doing these lines together, we're grabbing hold of the DOM element in an object form, and we're just updating one of these properties to something else, and that essentially changes that attribute. So that's attributes, that's one thing. The other thing that we can also do is edit styles. So with styles, there's actually an attribute called style that we can use to style HTML elements. I can do a really quick example of this here. So we could say, we can put in a style attribute and set it equal to color red. And we get this paragraph in red. So that's sort of like the inline styling that I talked about when we covered CSS for the first time. Generally is not a good way to write code if you're doing this in HTML, because it ends up being super messy and hard to track things. But so it turns out, okay, essentially, if you use the dot notation for the style attribute, you can basically specify an object which will be all of the styles that should apply to that particular element that you selected. So one little caveat with this, lots of times in CSS, you have property names that are 2 words or more strung together. So for example, background color or padding top. In CSS, we use kebab case, which I think is an amazing name to give this particular thing. I always find it ridiculously funny that it's called kebab case for some reason. In JavaScript, you can't have a dash in a variable name. So JavaScript will give you an error if you try to do this. So in JavaScript, if you want to set a particular property in CSS that has these 2 or more words, we need to convert from kebab case to camel case. So this example here, let's say we want to set background color, and then padding top. We'll say, okay, page body dot style dot background color in camel case equals something, or style dot padding top in camel case. We can't do a like for like, but this is just something that we figure out with practice. So don't feel the need to memorize this as usual. And then the other really important property that we can set is something called INNERHTML. The INNERHTML property essentially is everything inside of the outer tags of the element that you selected. So this is super flexible. Often if we have like a counter or something, or if we have some text that's warning the user with something, we can directly sort of grab the container of whatever we want to display and just inject something inside of it. But we could also do this with HTML elements. So we could set the INNERHTML to some text, which is more HTML, and that will just sort of magically create these elements, which is quite nice. So doing this here, we're selecting the page body, and we're setting the INNERHTML of the page body to this text here. What this will do is just wipe everything on the page, because the body contains absolutely every element on the page, and it will replace that INNERHTML with this line. Another thing that we can do, which is also quite useful, is using the plus equals operator. So the concatenation for strings, just adding something on the end. In this case, it will just add this text, this HTML element, onto the end of what we have in the body. So this is sort of the less destructive option that we might also want to go for. So another thing that we can do with the document object, with things that we've selected, is that we can actually create new elements and add them onto the page. So one way that we could do this is literally just using this INNERHTML property and just writing out whatever elements we want. The more sort of concrete, I don't want to say better, because I would just generally always rather do the INNERHTML thing myself. But the textbook way of creating an element is to use the create element method that we get from the document object. So this will create a new element of whatever we put in as a string here. So we pass in a tag name, and it'll create that element as like an object that's sort of bobbing around in our JavaScript code. It won't actually add it to anything. The way that we add one of these new elements to the screen is that we need to use the append child method. And this is a method that we get from a node that we've selected. So if this sounds confusing, I'm going to explain this in the next slide right here. So in this example, we're adding an image and a paragraph to our page body. So first line here, we're selecting the body. We're using query selector here, so it takes a CSS rule. We have nothing in front of this text, so it's a tag name. Going to look for the tag that's called body, and that gives us this DOM node, that's an object that we can do things with. Next, we're creating a new image tag using the document.createElement syntax. So this gives us back this object, which is sort of like a totally blank document node object that just, all it has is the identifier of an image. And then onto that, we're setting the source attribute to a picture of a kitten. And we're also doing some styling. So here we're just sort of arbitrarily entering a 1 pixel black border. But you can imagine if you're making like a totally new element, this could be way more attributes that we set and way more styles. We can do pretty much anything. And then this image exists in this bubble of something, an object that's sort of bouncing around our JavaScript code. The next thing we need to do is append this image to our page. So we grabbed hold of this page body right at the start. This is a DOM representation of that body element. And one of the methods that we get with every DOM element is this append child method. And we can use this append child method to add this new DOM node into the DOM tree to be the child of the body element. So that's kind of a lot that we just sort of, we ran through super quickly. Again, never worry about memorizing this stuff totally off by heart. It totally comes with practice. And the sort of JavaScript that you'll be doing at the end of the course that real developers actually do is actually pretty different to all of this stuff. So my day-to-day job involves absolutely no worrying about query selectors. It's just a little bit of prerequisite knowledge to be able to see how all of these pieces fit together. And yeah, just knowing some of this basic knowledge, you really just need a vague familiarity with things rather than an expert understanding in general. Okay, so that's creating an image and adding it to the page. This bottom thing is basically the same thing, except we're creating a paragraph text. We're using INNERHTML to add some text in. And again, this line we don't need actually. I changed this from earlier. We can just set the INNERHTML and then append that child onto the page. The little typo here. Okay, so I'm gonna do some manipulation of this DOM to show us what this looks like. So same page again. First thing I wanna do is just mess around with some of these attributes. Okay. So we have this heading tag. I want to try and edit the styles of this heading tag first. I think this is the easiest one to demonstrate because we can see the result. Okay, let's say heading dot style dot background color has to be camel case. I'm going to put into this box the value of yellow, nice, beautiful yellow background color. And that works just like magic. I saw this awesome quote recently that I really wanted to tell you all about, which is that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. And I really get the feeling with programming in general, just being able to understand how some of this stuff works, just being able to do some of this DOM manipulation, especially, it really feels like you can do magic. And hopefully this is a feeling that you guys get increasingly as this course goes on. Okay, so that's setting a style. I'll also do a demo of setting an attribute. So I'll do with this picture here. I'm just going to get the first one. Query selector. So this is the first image on the screen. That's a DOM node that I can do something with. So I'll say, okay, image dot width equals something that looks different, 500 pixels maybe. Oh, did that work? Didn't work. Why didn't it work? Did this work? Could it be 500 pixels already? Surely not. Image dot width. Can I just roll AMG? I'm not sure why this isn't working. Okay, wait. Okay, a good step, as always, if something goes wrong, is to start off by console logging things out, just to make sure they look as expected. So, okay, hang on. Okay, we just need to, it takes an integer, not a string. There we go. Okay, great, that worked. Okay, yeah, so the width property takes a number. It doesn't take a string. That was the difference. Probably there's a few of these rules that we need to know about for different elements, but hopefully we can figure that out with enough experience. Okay, so that's manipulating. We've got this node. We've selected it using this line up here, line 2. And here we're just changing one of these attributes. And if we want to change one of the styles, then it looks something like that. So that's the manipulation part. Yeah, and then we did this already, right? Creating nodes. Oh, we'll do a little demo of creating a node as well. Why not? Okay, so we have the document object. We always get that free with JavaScript. I'm going to use the create element method. Let's do something different. Blah, 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 blah. let's say, okay, an unordered list, a UL. I'm going to store this in a variable called UL, just to be boring. Okay, so this is an unordered list. We can even console log this out. I'll do a console.dir of that UL, just to show what it looks like. And we've done absolutely nothing with it. We've just created a new UL element. And as I say, this is just like a totally blank element that just classifies as a DOM node. So we get all of the standard bits and pieces that you usually get with DOM nodes like this. So we get this append child method, probably, surely. Append child, where is it? It's part of the proto is append child. This is a bit like black magic that I'm doing right here. I'm not going to explain what the proto is. Actually, I just recently realized, I recently learned about what happens when we use protos. But take it for granted that, okay, there is this thing called append child that we can use this UL with. Okay, but we have this unordered list. An unordered list, in general, it takes these li elements inside of it to work. So the super quick version of getting this to work is ul.INNERHTML equals, and then I'm just going to write some, we're going to write some HTML code just to make this super simple. And that could look like li stands for list item /li, here's an item. Okay, and then I'm going to put another one in as well. Here's another item. Okay, so basically here we have this unordered list, which is a type of HTML element, a UL tag appended to the screen. And then we're creating a bunch of list items, so the individual pieces that belong inside the unordered list. So unordered list is basically just bullet pointed list, and the li tags, the list items, are bullet point items in that list. So here we basically created this unordered list, and we have these two bullet points that we're appending in the lazy way with this INNERHTML method. Okay, so next step, none of this is showing up on the screen because this only exists as sort of like these hypothetical DOM nodes that are knocking around in our JavaScript file. We need to actually append these to the screen in order to see anything. So to do that, I'm going to grab the body element of the page, which everything belongs inside the body. So we did this already, so it shouldn't take too much explaining. Query selector body. So this is going to get the first element on the page that matches this query selection. So that will be our body. And I just want to use the append child method that we get from every selected DOM node. And I'm going to pass in this UL here. So we'll pass in the element that we created. And we can see that these two elements, these two list items inside of this UL have been appended to the body. So that's working as expected. The other thing I'm going to show, just as a bit of fun, with this whole, with this INNERHTML method, just to show how kind of maybe dangerous at the same time as super powerful it is, we can set the body's INNERHTML to nothing, and that just totally clears the entire HTML document. So we can see this in the console. We just have the body, and then there's nothing inside. There's an empty string which shows up as nothing in our browser. So use this sparingly. It can be rather dangerous if you don't know what you're doing with it. But yeah, so that's appending, creating new nodes and putting them onto the screen. Okay, so that's the DOM implementation. Okay, cool. So the last thing I want to talk about today is events. And these are another one of these awesome magical tools that we can use to do awesome things with our JavaScript. So I'm going to be introducing what they are. We'll be talking about different types of events, and we'll be making some event listeners that allow us to respond to something that the user does inside of our JavaScript file, and then triggering some updates to our HTML, usually. So an event in JavaScript, we can think about as an object. So the thing that we learned about last lecture with the magical super variable, an object, just like the document object. An object is essentially emitted or broadcast whenever an action occurs on the screen. So usually if the user does something. So things that the sort of examples of this sort of these sort of actions could be a click. So if a user clicks on something, that's registers an event that we can listen to. Or alternatively, there could be a move of a mouse. There could be a press of a key. There could be something coming into attention. Lots of these events that we can listen to, and then eventually we can handle with some code. So the general syntax for using events is that we have an element. So this is one of the HTML DOM node elements. So this is something that we get from query selector or something that we get from getElementById. So another one of these elements that we get for free is, another one of these methods that we get for free is add event listener. And the deal with a listener is that we pass in an event that we want to listen to. So in this case, it's a click of the element. And then we define an event handler function, which is the function that's going to run every time that event happens, basically. So a few things to know about this. One thing is that we're always attaching these event listeners to a specific element. So we'll have an example about this in the next slide or two, which will make more sense, hopefully. And then it's really crucial to understand that this second thing is a function. It's not an invocation of a function, which sounds kind of complicated. Just think about it again in terms of there being this black box, this factory that we have as a function. The black box takes inputs and it gives back outputs. We're actually passing in a factory. We're not passing in the factory being used. So if that sounds a little bit complicated, I think this probably makes more sense with an example. So I'll try and give it a little demo in a few slides' time. And something to note here is that we have this argument called event to this function, to the function that we're supplying. And we can access this event inside of this handler function. So we can find out things about the event that triggered the action. And we can also get the element that triggered that event through this event object. And I'll show that in a few slides' time, an example of how we might use that. So in terms of types of event, I mentioned a couple of these already. The one that we'll use continually in this course is going to be a click event. We have lots of events for tracking the position of mouses. We can specify a particular key being raised or pressed or moving even. Focus and blur are sort of like when you click on something, that element and sort of become in focus. There are particular ways that you can style things that are in and out of focus. Blur is something becoming out of focus. But the main ones to look at right now is just this click event. There's also one called change, which is quite useful if you have like a drop down that you're selecting between. So you can trigger the value of that drop down changing. But we'll talk about that in a few lectures' time. So one way that we can add event listeners to our code is that we can put in an attribute called on whatever. So in this case, we have on click, all lowercase, in our HTML. And we can write some code that will get executed in JavaScript. So in this case, we could define a function called say hi, and writing say hi with 2 parentheses like this. This is sort of like executing that function. We're invoking the function. So how this works is that when somebody clicks on this button, this line of JavaScript gets executed. And this line of JavaScript also has access to all the JavaScript that you connected to the site already. So in this case, we can think about this bottom thing as being like the black box, the factory that takes inputs and gives outputs. And this is like the using of the factory. This is like putting something into the factory and getting something back, which in this case would just be an alert. More often, we'll be using this add event listener syntax. And the add event listener, we're specifying type of event, and we're passing in a function. So this is like even more verbose than we were doing earlier. We can still define the function say hi, and adding this listener using the add event listener from the document node object that we grabbed in this first step. We're saying, okay, every time a click happens, this is the function that's going to be handling that click. So we pass the whole factory into that function, and this function figures out, okay, I need to fire this function every time something gets clicked. So that's the even shorter way of doing it. This syntax here, where we miss out the name of the function, this is called an anonymous function. So I think I mentioned this last lecture briefly. We can store functions in variables and give those variables a name. It turns out that we can even just not store it in a variable and just have the actual function value. And that's something that we can plug into this add event listener function. So this is the better way of writing this. This is the cleaner way of writing this, rather than creating the function and then putting it in. But this might be a little bit easier to wrap your head around this. Okay, we're putting the factory into this add event listener function. We're not putting the result of the factory, which we get from calling this function. Calling the function returns undefined. So if you passed in say hi with 2 parentheses, then we're passing in undefined. Yeah, maybe that's not super obvious, but don't worry about that just for now. Okay, so one other thing with events, we have a method on this event object that, as I said, corresponds to the event that just got fired, called prevent default. This is really useful to know about because lots of HTML elements on the page will have default things that get triggered when certain events happen. So the example we have here is we have this anchor tag, this link to woofcode.com that we put inside of our HTML. And by default, the behavior for a link element is that if you click on it, it opens up another window and then redirects you to that page. If we want to handle an event and have something different happen, so for instance, maybe we want to, I don't know, console log that we totally psyched them out by pretending like this was a link to WOOFCODE, but it's actually not. We can use this prevent default method before we write anything else inside of our handler. And this will just say, okay, don't do whatever you were supposed to do normally handling this type of element. We want to write something totally different here. So, okay. So that's a little bit of a side thing, just a nice thing to know about. It will come up every now and then. So from this event object, it's sometimes really useful to actually get the element that triggered that event. So we have this example here where we have this button that just says click me. We can grab hold of this particular button from the event. And the way that we do that is either using current target or target. So again, so this event object, we pass in this current target. This ends up being one of these DOM nodes. So it's another one of these object representations of a particular element on the page. That element exists within a tree, so it has a parent and it also can have children. And it comes with a whole host of properties that we can set and methods that we can use that are sort of shared between all of these DOM nodes. So what we're doing here is we're attaching this event listener to this button. So we're grabbing this button in the first line using the get element by ID, passing in my-btn. And we're adding an event listener on the click event. And inside of this handler function, we're grabbing that particular DOM node that corresponds to this button using the current target property. And as soon as we have that particular DOM node, we can do the same manipulation stuff that we were doing earlier with that particular node. So the example here is, okay, we're going to change the style of that button. So we're going to make the background color red instead of whatever it is by default, white. So we're using, okay, button.style.background color. We have this box inside of a box, and we can put whichever properties we want in there. So that changes the color to red after you click it. And then we're also using this INNERHTML property here to change the text inside the button. So originally the text inside the button is click me, but after pressing it, we're going to change this INNERHTML to clicked. So the button is going to change from white to red, and the text is going to change from click me to clicked. So that's a nice example to show just what sort of stuff we can do as soon as we have these event listeners that we can add to our HTML. So I'll do a quick example here. We're running a little bit low on time, so I'll try to make this short and sweet. Okay, so what's an easy one here? I'll just add a button. I think a button is a really nice, easy way of doing that. I'll do something kind of crazy, actually. Let's not worry about the time too much. Okay, let's say, okay, we have a paragraph tag which says you clicked the button, and then we have a span tag inside of it, which originally is going to be 0 times. Times. Okay, and I want to get rid of a bunch of this junk just so we're not crowding everything out. Okay, so we just have this text. You click the button 0 times. I probably haven't mentioned this, but a span tag is sort of like a shell of an element that doesn't really have any styling. Our browser just renders this exactly in the context of whatever's around it and doesn't mess with the styling, which is quite nice if you want to select something in particular on the page. So at the moment we just have, okay, you click this button 0 times, and I'm going to make a button element, which just says click me. Click me. And we'll give this an ID of my-btn. And then we'll give this paragraph, we'll give the span tag an ID of count. Okay, maybe we can't see that well. We don't need that much space. Okay, so we have this paragraph tag. You click the button however many times, and we have this button which just says click me. So in my JavaScript here, what I want to do is I want to grab hold of that button. Just get rid of all this junk as well, because we're not using that. We don't want these errors. Okay, button equals document dot query selector. I called this my btn. We use this hashtag again because this is an ID, not a tag or a class. And I'm going to grab that span element as well. So we'll say const span equals document dot query selector, passing in hashtag count. Okay, so we have these two elements, there are these nodes that we can do stuff with. What I want to do now is say button dot add event listener. So we're going to add a listener to a particular event to this button. The type is going to be a click, nice and simple. And then we have this handler function here, which gives us an event to work with. So just as a sanity check, I'm just going to console log out, console.dir, this event to be specific. And then we'll see, okay, if I press this button, we get this event. So this event gets emitted every time we do something. And because we've set up this listener, we can track this event and we can do things with this event inside of this event handler function. And we can see this event, so it's sort of like the DOM node. There's a bunch of information. Some of the information is like, okay, where is the cursor when this was clicked? I think, yeah, there's a timestamp. This is probably in, can't be milliseconds because there's only 1,000 of them. There's maybe in the seconds since, no, maybe not. I'm not sure what this timestamp is. Probably since the page load in seconds, maybe, milliseconds, 3 seconds, possibly. There's a bunch of properties that define how the event worked. And then there's also this current target and target property. So target here is the button. So we can see this sort of highlighting there. That's the button that we clicked. And current target, it says it's null, but really that would also work as well. Just trust on that. But we can use the target property to get the button. But in this case, I don't want to do this. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to update this number every time we click the button. So I'll say span.innerHTML equals span.innerHTML plus 1. Okay, and this isn't going to work, so I'll show you why it doesn't work. We're using the plus as a string here because the INNERHTML is a string. This is a string, it's not a number. So the fix here is to say, okay, number span.innerHTML. Okay, and we can see this working, and this works totally well, which is awesome. So what this is doing is every time there's a click, we get this event. We get this event that gets emitted, and this function gets run. And inside this function, we're grabbing hold of the text inside of this element here, this span. We're taking that character, which is a string, we're casting it as a number, we're adding 1 to it, and then we're using this dot notation here with the INNERHTML to throw out everything that was already in this INNERHTML, which was the 0, and put this new number there in its place. Okay, so that's the whole shtick with these events. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about pretty much is another way that we can grab input from users, which is forms. So we didn't really talk about forms so far in this class. It's one of these many HTML elements that I sort of skirted over in week 1 and 2. The deal with a form is that we can add lots of different input fields that kind of look different ways, and how the input fields look depend on this type. So if we have an input type of text, that's like a text input where you could write your name or something. So the first one here is literally just an input that says, okay, first name. We'll expect me to put Adam in it, for example. If we have a type of radio, it's like a radio button, which is like this, these like circles with like a dot in for the one that's selected. And the deal with the radio buttons is only one of them can be checked off. So if you click on one of them, then change it, then that sort of unclicks the other one. So here I can either be married or not married. By default, it looks like by default, we're saying people are married in this form apparently, which is interesting. And I'm also giving these married buttons a class, which we'll be using in the next slide. It turns out if you use an input with the type of submit, then this is like a submit button, which will automatically try to submit the form, which usually we don't want to do, because this will assume that our backend API exists on the same server as the code that's running the HTML, which is usually not true. If that sounded complicated, don't worry about it at all. We'll cover it in a few lectures' time. Probably that did sound complicated, so don't worry about it. Okay, so if we want to get the value of one of these fields, it turns out there's a property called value that automatically gets added to this type of DOM node. So in this case, okay, we're grabbing this this input with the ID of first name, with the name of first name and the ID of first name. Yeah, this one. So this is a text field. The user's written something into it. We can grab hold of that input, the text field, and we can get the value using the value property on that text node. So we're actually checking what the attribute is for a particular input. It turns out you can also lock the input to only be a particular name, to be a particular string value, for instance. And if you do that, you'll always get that value that's being locked in. We'll probably show you that in a couple of lectures time, I think. But yeah, we can essentially get the value from this particular element's input. With radio buttons, it's a little bit more tricky. We want to select all the radio buttons, and we'll have to have a function that sort of figures out which one of them is checked. So we didn't do an example of this yet, but you might have guessed that we can do this, this iteration over a list of things. Query selector all essentially gives us back an array of node items. So it's every element with the class of married btn. So it would be this one and this one. We get an array back. We can loop over that array using this like messy, annoying for loop syntax. You know, until we've reached the number of radios, we're going to run this code for every one. And we're just saying, okay, if the radio button that we're looking at, that particular DOM node, has an attribute called checked, which is true, then we're gonna change the value of the radio button that we're tracking here to that value. And if not, we'll keep checking the radio buttons. One of those radio buttons will always have checked as true. So eventually we'll get the selected answer that way. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about with forms is this is one of these circumstances where we need to use this prevent default, especially if we've wired it up like this, where we actually have a submit type input as the button rather than an HTML button tag. So okay, so let's say a user has completed the form and they press submit and they expect something to happen. We can run a event listener onto that submit button to get the value of the form when they press submit. So this makes sense. You can imagine, okay, we're coding the front end to facebook.com. Somebody's logging in, they have their first name, email address, they have their email address and password, let's say, and then they press submit to log in. First thing that we need to do is prevent default, because the default is that this form will try to submit something to our API backend. Again, doesn't really matter what that is right now. That's too complicated for this lecture. We need to remember to use this prevent default when we're using an input of type submit. But once we have that, we can say, okay, give me the value of the element that has the ID of first name. So grab me a DOM representation of this element right here, which is our text input, and get the value. So in this case, we're just console logging whatever the name is that we put in. But you could imagine in the future, this sort of material might be logging us into our account. It could be doing some sort of business logic on our server. We could be making some sort of request. We could be doing something with a page. As soon as we have this set up so that we have this event handler that's reacting to an event, we can basically do whatever we want. And a form is just a great way of being able to ask for lots of information from a user in quite an easy to understand way. Okay, last tiny thing that I want to talk about is a library called jQuery that you might have heard of if you've already tried to do some sort of JavaScript programming before. jQuery is a library, so it's one of these things that some really smart developers decided to make up to make our lives easier rather than having to do all of this complicated query selector thing, blah, blah, blah. It essentially just makes it easier for us to manipulate DOM elements. So in this example here, we could say, okay, rather than this whole document.getElement by ID dot blah, 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 we can just use a $, which is the jQuery shorthand for that library. And we can just use a CSS selector. And rather than having to go style dot something else, we can just put a value in with the CSS here. Some people find this easier than the query selectors. Normal courses would teach you jQuery, like you have to learn jQuery before you can start doing React. I think we never really use jQuery as real developers anymore, so I think it's dumb to keep teaching that as the default thing to tell new learners of computer science. So I'm not teaching this in this course, but just so that you're at least aware of it, so that if people talk about jQuery, you know what it is. Also with event handling, jQuery is quite nice. If we want to register an event on several different DOM nodes, so if we use query selector all on tag name, for example, we want all paragraph tags on the page. We want to console log something when one of these paragraph tags gets clicked. You have to do a loop over every DOM node. So sort of similar to what we had with this radio buttons thing. You need to loop over every single DOM node and add a separate listener for every single one. The nice thing with jQuery is you can just select a whole selection and just use a .click element. So in this case, it's not really doing this, but you can imagine, okay, what if there's like a class name called alert? So rather than #alert, it could be .alert. It would just automatically put the same listener on all of the alerts, which saves a little bit of time and makes things a little bit cleaner. But as I say, don't worry about this. We're not covering jQuery in this class. It's just one of these things absolutely everybody knows when they start programming, but we're going to be skipping past this and just sticking with the bare bones JavaScript before we move on swiftly to React. Okay, so that's everything for this week. This week's homework will be released hopefully by the end of today. Again, just normal homework will mostly be free code camp exercises. We're at the point with our coding that it's much more important to get some actual practice with the syntax than it is to watch any videos or do any reading. So probably for the homework, there'll be 45 minutes to an hour worth of just exercises to try this stuff out for yourself. And as usual, the bonus homework will be a more involved project where you can practice this stuff on your real computer and have a go at some problems to tackle. Okay, so that is everything for this week.